But don't forget, when we're talking about sexual reproduction, the whole big concept of it is that you have sperm and egg coming together. So when you're talking about disadvantages, the things to think about are, it requires time to do a couple things. Well, time and energy to do a couple things. Produce the sperm and produce the eggs, and then also for the sperm and egg to come together and find each other. There's going to be species receptors that need to bind between sperm and egg, and you need to have time to find not just a mate, but the best mate. The biggest advantage is that it produces genetic variation, and we'll talk about that a little bit. This is more like why and how our 111 concept, but we'll address it. So we do internal sexual reproduction, but there are a lot of species that do it externally. Like most species in the ocean will release their sperm and egg at the warmest day on the full moon of the summer, or those like kind of 3 months of the full moon that are the warmest months. So let's talk a little bit about eggs. Eggs are very unique in terms of meiosis. Meiosis means the production in an organism of the gametes. Gametes, when we're talking about gametes, we mean sperm or egg, the sex cells. Eggs are huge in comparison to the size of sperm, and we're going to get into why. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about where they're produced. Eggs are produced in the female gonads. A gonad is a sex organ. They're produced in the ovaries. All the other female structures we call accessories. And what we mean by accessories, we mean that they're going to do a few things. They're going to help the sperm get to the egg. So accept the sperm, help to conduct the sperm, get the sperm to the egg, nourish the egg, and also there are a lot of structures in there that are going to help to nourish the embryo, should it be developed. The ovaries are unique also in that there's not a tube that takes you from the ovary to the fallopian tube, and the fallopian tube, as I mentioned last time, fallopian tube, ovarian tube, oviduct, 3 names. If this is one of the ovaries, remember that in biological females, there's an ovary on each side, typically of the body, and that from the ovary, there's a fallopian tube that has fimbriae, these little kind of like finger-like projections, and those will be inside the entire fallopian tube. And the fimbriae and the ovary are kind of like that. There's a little spacing between, it's not like a tube-to-tube connection. So what happens with the ovary is that the follicle cells with the oocyte, we call it an oocyte, not an egg, technically, because an oocyte is like a pre-fertilized egg. We only call it an egg once it's fertilized. So that's kind of like a big misconception also. So the oocyte bursts through the wall, the oocyte that has all the follicle cells developed around it. You saw that in lab the other day. Oocyte with the follicular liquid, and all of those things we're going to talk about next time. All of those follicle cells in the follicular liquid do a couple things. They provide energy. That follicular liquid has a lot of energy and nutrients in it that are going to help, if the oocyte gets fertilized, to go through cleavage from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells until it's embedded into the endometrium, and thus then the endometrium kind of takes over that nourishment job and protection until the placenta is formed. So it's kind of interesting too in the biological female that there's these stages of ensuring that when a sperm and egg come together, that it can continue to cleave or develop. This picture is pretty amazing. It shows you that the oocyte with all of the follicle cells is bursting through the wall of the ovary. Ovulation, the release of the oocyte from the ovary, sometimes females can feel like a twinging or even some pain in one side or the other during ovulation. Sometimes, yeah. So sometimes I feel like if there's ever a point where you're like, you just feel a little pain in your one side, it's probably ovulation. Yeah, that's pretty wild. And then it just kind of like heals back up, and a month later, bursts through again.
So there's like no core or anything, it just goes through whatever it wants to go through?
Yeah, and it's going to be released in that fimbriae where the fimbriae are there. I mean, on occasion there can be ones that burst in the wrong way, and then.
So once it bursts, it go down the fallopian tube?
Yeah, so ideally, hypothetically, that's what you want to happen, so that the fimbriae, they're like there to kind of like make sure that that oocyte is going down the fallopian tube to the ovary, to the uterus. Yeah, pretty wild. All right, as we looked at before in lab, we saw that this is the female reproductive system. In the we call it urogenital area, for like urinary and the genitals in the same area. With females, there is the release from the digestive system, so that you've got the rectum and the anus with the reproductive system in the middle and the urinary system up front. So structures to know that you have the sacrum, the last bones of the spinal cord. The very last bone is called the coccyx. You have the rectum and the anus. There's the ovary, the fallopian tube. Again, the fallopian tube can be called fallopian tube, oviduct, ovarian tube. You can see the fimbriae, but also note that there are fimbriae all the way inside of the fallopian tube, sweeping the oocyte down to the uterus. There's two parts of the uterus. There is the muscle, the myometrium, and the lining, the endometrium. The bottom of the uterus is called the cervix. Cervix leads to the vagina. There's the clitoris, bundle of nerve cells. And then you have the urinary bladder and the urethra. You also have the pubic bone on the front side, so that we have these bones that protect all of this, these openings out to the external world. So we've got pubic bone and we've got the end of the spinal cord. In addition, you have labia, which are skin flaps that are going to protect all of, the reproductive system and the urinary system. So they're kind of part of the external barriers of the immune system, that they're going to try and prevent things from getting into these holes. You've got two skin flaps here. You've got the smaller labia, called the labia minor, and then you've got the larger labia, the outer labia, called the labia major. So a little bit about egg production. Egg production begins in the fetus. All the eggs are produced before a biological female is born. So they're there. They're kind of just waiting until puberty to be released one per month, typically one per month.
So you know when you're like half term and they can finally have an idea of what the sex of the baby is? Before they even do that, are the eggs starting to develop in the fetus?
They are, yeah. So, so kind of interesting that even before a developing fetus can be sexed, meaning assigned a biological female or biological male sex, that fetus, if it's a biological female, is already producing the oocytes in their body.
Oh.
Yeah. Eggs are released typically one per month after puberty happens. When the oocytes are released, 1 per month, we call it ovulation. Some biological females will have 2 oocytes per month released. It's usually a genetic factor. You see it in the history of families. Egg development doesn't finish, and we'll take a look at meiosis in the females until after fertilization occurs. So the stages of meiosis, one of the things that we're going to see is that there's 2 stages of meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, that oocytes undergo meiosis 1 and only undergo meiosis 2 if fertilization occurs. So most oocytes never finish the stages of meiosis. All of the other structures, in addition to the ovaries, are accessories. We call them accessories. They're going to do things like nourish and accept the sperm, help the fertilized oocyte or egg to develop, move the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. So again, oviduct, it's called the fallopian tube or uterine tube. All of those are acceptable names. Fimbriae, little hairs inside to keep sweeping the oocytes to the uterus.
What's the purpose of the cervix?
So the cervix has it's just the bottom of the organ, the uterus. The cervix is a connector to the vagina. The other thing about the cervix is the cervix has a pore or a tube at the bottom that is very, very, very small, or usually kind of closed up. It can open up so that it opens during appropriate times in either childbirth or menstruation, and so that it can allow the endometrium out during menstruation, so it'll open it, and then during childbirth, one of the ways that they see if a biological female is ready to give birth is they look at the dilation of the cervix. So remember that, when you hear how many centimeters dilated, that the cervix opens when childbirth is beginning. So it's just kind of to connect the two, the vagina and the uterus.
It's a little protective in a way.
And it is. It's also protective so that it can prevent, if something gets into the vagina, like a bacteria infection, a bacterial infection, it can close and protect the uterus there too. Yeah. So this is exaggerated. This is a little bit more descriptive of how it visually looks, is that you have a little bit of a spacing kind of internally like this between the fallopian tube and the ovary. This is exaggerated to just kind of give you the idea that the ovary and the fallopian tube are not directly connected with a tube or a pore. This is pretty far. This would be I don't know what the percentage of oocytes would be to get from here into here if there were that much space between. But they are much closer like that. It's more realistic. This is also the picture that you saw before of the female reproductive system. It looks almost like the endometrium part is just not quite connected to the fallopian tube, but there is a tube from here, an opening into the endometrium. So this one, you can see a more realistic connection between the fallopian tube, ovarian tube, oviduct, and the endometrium, or the inside of the uterus. So like this, it doesn't look like there's a connection between the two, but really there is, and it's just the cross-section that you're looking at. Makes this a little bit skewed in terms of, I wish they would put a little opening there. Okay, so a little bit about ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. So ovarian cycle refers to the ovulation or the movement of the oocyte, the development of the follicle cells, and the bursting of the oocyte with the developed follicle cells through the wall of the ovary. And the menstrual cycle is the preparation that in case there is a fertilized oocyte, that endometrium is full of glands, nutrients, energy, that it's going to nourish and nurture, house the fertilized oocyte until a placenta can be formed by the biological female. So that's just kind of like two differences between there. Between the two, the whole month, oftentimes we call the menstrual cycle, but really there's kind of like two parts of that month. So ovarian cycle, the ovulation, and then the menstrual cycle, the release of the endometrium, because there is not a fertilized oocyte. It's approximately 28 days. There's a lot of skewing on that. Textbook-wise, we was go like, here's what happens in 4 weeks or 28 days. But most biological females do not have a textbook cycle. Cycles can be genetically, can be longer, can be shorter, and then also dependent on stress, or could be other factors, medication. World-class athletes who are really stressing their body with working out will often not have a menstrual cycle at all, because all of their energy is going toward working the muscles of their body, their respiratory system, so that they can be a world-class athlete. So there's a lot of things that can skew this cycle. For biological females, you may notice that during finals time, maybe your cycle's off a little bit. There's great apps that can track all this too, so that you can enter in your information and it will kind of predict what's going to happen with you. And even that, it might be off, because depending on what's in your life, or it could be a medication that you take. Certain antibiotics, for example, will skew that totally.
I like on the apps where I like click, I'm like, I'm crabby today.
Right, and that's a stressor, right? So yeah, that's
like, I'm feeling great today. I don't know. I'm like, oh, you care about my feelings? Thank you.
yeah. And the feelings are stress or non-stress, right? So that can skew all that. So that data is pretty important in terms of like the cycle. Okay, so we're gonna start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, GnRH is produced in the hypothalamus. From there, GnRH is released into the interstitial space, which then binds to GnRH, is going to bind to a receptor on the pituitary gland, which is going to stimulate the pituitary gland to release FSH and LH. Sounds similar to puberty. When puberty begins, this cycle happens. This happens in both biological males and biological females, and has an influence on the production of the gametes, the sperm or the egg. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates follicle cells, or protective cells around the oocyte to further develop. Those follicle cells secrete estrogen in the ovaries. Estrogen is then released into the interstitial spaces around the ovaries, and it's picked up by the blood and taken back. Oh, excuse me, before I get there. The FSH, the LH, and the estrogen all together further help the follicle cells to, I like to call it, beef them up, right? Get bigger, surround more around the oocyte. This promotes 1 per month, just 1, to get one, typically one ready to undergo ovulation. Let me mention too that if there's 1 per month, biological females have 2 ovaries, it generally will switch back and forth, so that you can have the follicle cells on one side really getting ready while this one is ovulating. So it kind of almost does like a double. You almost get 2 months of that getting one oocyte ready in each ovary as it goes back and forth. Also, as the follicle cells develop more and more estrogen is released, which causes the endometrium to get bigger and bigger, to get more endometrium, so that again, in case there is a fertilized oocyte, fertilized egg at that point. Estrogen is released in the interstitial cells around the ovary, picked up by capillaries, travels in the blood, back up to the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the hypothalamus to produce more GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Let's answer this question. Is that a positive or a negative feedback loop? Positive, right? Because the first thing in the chain was GnRH. So we go through and we have GnRH, LH and FSH, estrogen. Estrogen goes back to the hypothalamus and says more. So we're going to go again. So that's a positive feedback loop because the last thing in the chain tells the first thing in the chain, go again.
So do other mammals get a period and stuff too?
Yes.
Is it very similar to humans?
Similar, yes. Some of the cycle can be longer or shorter. Usually the bigger mammals are longer. So like for house pets, right, like dogs and cats, for example, we get them fixed and then they don't undergo this anymore.
Oh, because I was like, man, I've never seen like a dog or a cat have a menstrual cycle.
Yeah, we found our dog, I found our dog in a park, Calumet Park in Calumet City a couple years ago and picked her up and I was like, I'm gonna find her owner. She wasn't chipped. I could not find a posting anywhere, called the police station, nothing about her, but she was clearly in a house because she knew certain commands, like stay, sit, roll over. I still want to take credit for teaching her that, but she did have a menstrual cycle, and so I was like, oh, so we had to be like, in the meantime of figuring out if she was fixed or not, took her, saw if she had a chip, they told me, they felt around, and like, oh no, she's not fixed, so then we had to get her fixed. The other thing that they do is they, like for house pets, they'll put now a green tattoo. They tattoo them in the urogenital area on the skin, so that if a house pet is fixed or not, they have a little green line. They get their own little tattoos. But that prevents them from having the menstrual cycle. They take out all of the female parts. All right, so we're back in the chain. GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, which is going to stimulate or bind with receptors on the pituitary gland to produce a bigger surge of LH especially and FSH around halfway in the cycle. So if we're talking textbook-wise, 14 days, but like if you're on a 30-day cycle, 15 days. So depending on what your monthly cycle is. Also remember that everything in these chains can be altered depending on stress in your days, right? So if Emma has a crabby day, it could prolong this 14th day from happening to 16 days, for example. Or if it's happening right around finals time, could prolong that even longer. So it just depends on what's going on in your life. We're gonna get to this after we go through the entire ovarian cycle and menstrual cycle, but the process of meiosis, this is going to cause that first stage of meiosis to happen. And we'll talk about getting a secondary oocyte in the polar body. We'll look at that in just a bit. So hold on asking questions about that because we'll get to it. Oh, no, we're gonna get to it now. Look at it, I put it in there. Okay, so the process of meiosis is making a oocyte, excuse me, The sex cell, the original, what we call the parent cell, is called an oogonium. The oogonium, what you can see here in terms of chromosomes is that there is, what you're seeing is one set of chromosomes in this illustration. So that you have one big yellow, one big purple, one little purple. In humans, what we would have here is we would have we would have 46 individual chromosomes in the cell, but it's not showing them all because it would be too crowded. Going into the process of meiosis, so in meiosis it's showing meiosis as the blue cells and before meiosis as the yellow cell. Right here, what would happen is that the DNA would replicate. And so going from the oogonium, the parent cell, to the primary oocyte, the DNA replicates. And what that means is that every individual chromosome is going to replicate and get a sister chromatid. Some of this might be ringing bells for you. Sister chromatids are genetically identical. So going into that process, there's 2 of each kind of chromosome. So here you can see each one of these individuals. Now it almost looks like an X, because what they have connected by a centromere is a genetically identical copy of themselves. What happens from here to here is a process what we call crossing over. Crossing over will cause these in the primary oocyte to actually cut off and exchange pieces of chromatids of a tetrad. So that what we would have looked at more in Bio 111 is that these four, that the chromosome pieces, like the purple and the yellow, will lay across each other like that, and basically cut off. And this piece from this chromosome, the end piece will go onto this one, and an equal sized one, equal genetics, will kind of cut off and go onto this one. So they cross over pieces. And what that does in this tetrad crossing over is it allows for genetic variation in the primary oocyte. Then what happens, the stimulation of meiosis 1 is where we're at, is that the primary oocyte is going to divide into 2 cells. What you end up having happen here is very different than what happens in the production of the sperm. In production of the sperm, what you end up with are 4 equal-sized sperm. The sperm, the primary spermatid, undergoes this tetrad thing and the crossing over, but what happens here in meiosis 1 is the stimulation of meiosis 1 by that big surge of LH and FSH at around day 14 is that you get 1 big cell and 1 little cell. The little cell, the point of having these 2 cells is that you want the genetic information to go in half. Because eventually what we want in our egg cell is we want 1 set of chromosomes. If you have even a little bit extra DNA, let alone a whole extra set of chromosomes, you have major issues. Or, well, you can, sometimes you don't, but for the most part, a lot of extra DNA, even though we might think extra DNA is good, it is not. We want the precise exact amount of DNA in our cells. When we have a little bit extra, or not enough, or a lot extra, or a lot missing, you have problems. So meiosis 1, the division of this primary oocyte's DNA, you can see that each one, the secondary oocyte and the polar body, get 1 of these sister chromatids of each tetrad. I should say the chromosome with their sister chromatid of each tetrad. So that when you're looking at this set here, whatever this chromosome, let's say this is chromosome 1 and this is chromosome 2, you can see that the secondary oocyte has 1 of the chromosome 1s, and the polar body has the other chromosome 1, and for chromosome 2, secondary oocyte has 1 chromosome 2, and the polar body has 1 chromosome 2. So they each have an equal amount of DNA. So we're dividing up the DNA, but the secondary oocyte is going to take all the cytoplasm. And in the cytoplasm, it's not just like a liquid for everything to be in. And also remember, there's a set of organelles in each of these, so that you get a set of organelles in each, but the secondary oocyte gets all the cytoplasm, and in the cytoplasm, there's lots of energy and nutrients. So you get one bigger cell with a lot of energy and nutrients, one that doesn't really have anything. Textbook-wise, a lot of times textbooks will say the polar body will then divide into two polar bodies, but because there's not a lot of space in there, everything's crammed in, right? There's not much cytoplasm, there's not much room. All the organelles plus a whole set of chromosomes, would there hypothetically be enough space for the chromosomes to divide again into individual chromatids? I don't think so. That's just my opinion, is that the polar body will go and get reabsorbed by probably like the body and the fallopian tube. I don't think it'll divide more, but hypothetically, it would divide more if it had space, but I don't think it will.
So the polar bodies are produced when the body's about to release one oocyte every month, or do the polar bodies all get made when before you're born?
They get made during the process of meiosis in the body once per month. So this happens once per month.
Okay. And
Yeah.
then the polar bodies, they go and they get reabsorbed.
Yeah, the polar bodies are useless to our body. So they just, like, this energy gets reabsorbed by the body.
But where do they end up going? Do they end up like in the uterus as well, or do they just never come out of the ovary into the fallopian tubes?
This is happening at ovulation, so it could be like right at the top of the ovary or in the beginning of the fallopian tube. Yeah, somewhere in there just gets like, it's like metabolic waste product that just gets kind of gobbled up by probably a white blood cell. This, the second meiosis, meiosis 2, only happens if the secondary oocyte is fertilized. Otherwise, this never happens, and then this goes into the endometrium, it gets swept into the endometrium, and gets flushed out with the menstruation, or with the endometrium release during menstruation. So if, let's say, a sperm wiggles its way in here, it's like an alarm goes off, and it says, okay, let's do it, let's do the second stage of meiosis, and the sperm would be in here still. Sperm would stay in the egg, and a secondary polar body releases a set of chromosomes, a set of organelles, and the egg gets all of the cytoplasm again. And we'll talk about that maybe today or maybe tomorrow in lecture of what happens and why we want that. The follicle cells continue to mature or develop. And what they become is they become what's called a corpus luteum. So we have the follicle cells just continue to advance and change into the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is a little bit different than all the other follicle cells because the corpus luteum not only becomes, it like produces this jelly-like layer around the egg, but also secretes not only more estrogen, because the follicle cells, remember in the first round of that feedback cycle, the follicle cells were also releasing estrogen, but now the corpus luteum, or that outer layer, produces progesterone too. So biological females have those two hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle. We haven't seen progesterone yet, but now we're going to see it. Estrogen and progesterone, whatever isn't. So both of these, what they're going to do is that they're going to continue to tell the uterus to produce more endometrium. Then, whatever's done being utilized is going to diffuse into the interstitial or extracellular area, picked up by the blood. It's going to go back to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to have receptors for both of these. And it's going to say, hey, hypothalamus, no more GnRH. have done your job of stimulating the release of one oocyte this month. So stop it. We don't want any more oocytes. We want to focus on one oocyte so that we can have one little oocyte that might get fertilized to become one pregnancy. So we have one that all of the energy and nutrients of the endometrium can go to. Emma, did you have a question?
No, I think you answered it.
Okay.
I was gonna ask if this process only happens if the egg is fertilized or unfertilized, but I think you said that it can be unfertilized.
Doesn't matter, yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't matter. This is just gonna, the idea is that so all of this like feedback doesn't know whether there's going to be sexual intercourse that happens. It just does its job once per month,
Okay.
regardless.
I just got confused because I know once it implants itself in the endometrium, it then produces more hormones and
Yes.
stuff, so I was just making sure.
Yes, so doesn't matter.
Okay.
This whole like 28 days, one ovarian cycle and menstrual cycle happens once per month, regardless of whether there's intercourse happening or not. That's what our body, biological female's body is programmed to do, period. Yeah, period. If GnRH is inhibited, it also will reduce the production of LH and FSH by the pituitary gland, which means that if all of these are inhibited, no more follicles are developed that month. Is this second time around positive or negative feedback?
Negative.
Negative, right? Because the last thing in the chain told the first thing in the chain, stop it, don't go again. Okay, yeah. And the whole reason why is the progesterone produced by the corpus luteum in the second loop around says, hey, GnRH, don't go again. But estrogen and progesterone, as I mentioned before, they are going to say to the uterus, more endometrium, because someone might be coming, something might be coming, might be fertilized, and might need a nice hospitable home, energy, nutrients. The blood vessels are going to begin to like kind of develop more in case there is fertilization, and that will be like starting the path of a placenta to be made, and then the placenta, the oocyte goes from the energy and the nutrients of the endometrium to like structure that's going to make a blood-to-blood connection to ensure that there is this flow of energy and nutrients to the developing embryo, and also taking away of all of the waste products as well. So endometrium gonna thicken, it's gonna beef up. There's only a small window. There's only a few days that if fertilization does not occur at this point, so you're at about like week 3 in the cycle, that if there is, and this happens in the fallopian tube, that after ovulation, there's only like, it goes a few days, there's only a few day window in the fallopian tube for fertilization to occur. And so then that like little oocyte is making its way toward the uterus. Before the oocyte even gets to the uterus, if fertilization doesn't happen, it starts to disintegrate. So the corpus luteum starts to break down, follicle cells, follicular liquid, and the genetic material all start to disintegrate. They start to break down. So there's only a little tiny window every month where pregnancy can occur. If all that disintegrates, remember that the corpus luteum, the follicle cells that have matured, were pumping out estrogen, more estrogen, and progesterone. Those are going to start to disintegrate, which means that estrogen and progesterone levels go down. The lack of estrogen and progesterone, remember that estrogen and progesterone were saying, let's add to the endometrium? So those go down, and with them going down, it's going to stop producing more endometrium, but it's also going to stimulate the uterus to contract. High estrogen and progesterone levels during a pregnancy prevent the uterus from contracting. So an important thing about the development of the embryo is that the embryo, when it develops, when it's fertilized and develops more, it's going to say basically those levels of estrogen and progesterone are going to prevent the uterus from contracting and pushing out the pregnancy. So when they're high, nothing happens. When they go down, it's going to push out, the uterus is going to contract and push the endometrium out, which begins the menstrual cycle or menstruation. On average, it takes a week from beginning to end of pushing out the endometrium, but depends on the female. Could be 3 days, could be 12 days. This can change too. If you are stressed out, it could make you have extra endometrium, which means that it's going to have extra, you're going to need extra time for menstruation. So sometimes when you're stressed out, two things can happen. Depends on you, is that you could have very little endometrium and maybe you only get menstruation of a couple days, or it could be that you're stressed out and it elongates somewhere in here and makes extra menstrual and extra endometrium, which makes for an extra long menstrual cycle. So everything can shift with stress. The Latin word menses means month. So that's why they say a monthly cycle, but not all months are 28 days either. Yeah. Reduction in progesterone and estrone cause menstruation. No longer inhibits the hypothalamus from producing GnRH. So, after about a week, when estrogen, remember progesterone was the thing that was saying that the hypothalamus don't produce GnRH, but progesterone has decreased because the corpus luteum has disintegrated. And so when progesterone is gone, it takes about another, like by the end of the menstrual cycle, the estrogen alone is like, hey, I'm alone again. So let's start to produce GnRH, LSH, FSH, and start the cycle all over again. So that progesterone is like a start-stop thing in the whole process. Is that when it's around, stops it, when it's low, continues it again. If there is a pregnancy, progesterone levels stay high and don't allow this to happen. So if there is a fertilization, there's an embryo present, the progesterone levels ideally stay high and say, we don't need any more ovulation because we got one that we're going to concentrate on. We got one thing in here, one embryo that we're going to work on. Some women may have low progesterone, and that's one of the many reasons that a miscarriage can occur, is that a woman just like naturally produces a lower progesterone, or could be that month that they produced a lower progesterone because of stress or something else that was going on, or medication. So there's so many reasons why the progesterone levels could be lower in a biological female, and it could be just that particular month, or it could be every month. So there's a lot of reasons why miscarriage might happen.
So with that low progesterone, does the miscarriage maybe happen because the endometrium isn't thick enough to provide for the cycle?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a result of the low progesterone, could be that not enough endometrium is in there too. Yeah. So if one of the things that they'll test for, so once someone knows that they're pregnant, they go see their doctor, their OBGYN, they will take a blood test, and that blood test is going to test for levels of estrogen, levels of progesterone, and it's going to determine, like, is the progesterone level high enough, then you're good. If it's low enough, they're going to supplement the woman with a progesterone prescription. So they'll get progesterone to kind of keep that high. That's kind of like one of the things that if someone has had like a miscarriage or two, they'll be like, oh, let's check that progesterone. And ahead of time, if they're trying already be supplementing with the progesterone. So there's a lot of things that get looked at these days. Remember, we looked at this in lab, that we're looking at the oocytes, that the oocytes near the top of the ovary will have a lot more follicle cells, follicular liquid with all of that extra nutrients and energy in it. And then you can see ovulation occurring here. Kind of the change in color from this like pink and purple to more purple and white is indicating in this illustration that the corpus luteum has been formed. Okay, menstruation, let's answer this question, occurs due to a decrease in what? Which one? Yeah, B. So estrogen and progesterone, but I never highlighted here. Estrogen and progesterone decreasing will stimulate menstruation to occur. Oh, I need a third one for that. Okay. Sometimes I'm right. This is a really fascinating illustration because there's all kinds of things that are shown in this illustration, and what you're seeing is stacked on top of each other, all the things that will be happening simultaneously. So that if you go from top to bottom, that if we're saying that the beginning of a cycle, day 0 is when menstruation occurs, that when menstruation occurs, you have a lot of endometrium, but you have low estrogen and progesterone, and follicle cells are just starting their kind of like development. FSH levels are kind of low, and GnRH is low, and that when the cycle kind of, I was like mentally like to start here, because I feel like, okay, so GnRH starts to get high here after menstruation. GnRH starts to get high, or it's going to stimulate this to start to be pumped out, and then the follicle cells are going to develop more. Estrogen levels, because the follicle cells are developing more, estrogen levels are higher here. Eventually you get to a couple weeks later, and what you see is that there's a surge of GnRH around the second week. LH and FSH thus are higher. Ovulation occurs. Estrogen levels are high. Another week later, progesterone levels are high because you've got now corpus luteum, but you only have a little window that the corpus luteum is around, because after a few days, it's going to start to disintegrate. And with the disintegration of the corpus luteum, it causes estrogen and progesterone levels to plummet. This has already been developing more, ready for menstruation, and everything else drops down. So just know when you're looking at this illustration, you're looking what's happening all at once, up and down. So embryo keeps pumping out estrogen and progesterone. So as the embryo is fertilized, the egg is fertilized, the embryo keeps those levels of estrogen and progesterone high the entire pregnancy. And when progesterone is high, it means that the endometrium will not be pushed out. It means that the uterus isn't going to contract. I mentioned this when we talked about pregnancy tests. In addition, there's another hormone that if you have fertilization, it goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. There's another hormone that's produced by the developing embryo. Do you remember which one of these it was? Yeah, CG. So CG is the thing that acts as an antigen on a pregnancy test to say, positive, something's in there. So you've got these that are going to be high during a pregnancy, and these are going to be low during a pregnancy. Blashill releases CG. CG also prevents the breakdown of the corpus luteum. So corpus luteum continues to develop, pumps out estrogen and progesterone, and the CG comes from the developing embryo. So when they say that a female is hormonal, it is true. There are these hormones that are going up and down all month, right? So there is a lot. Hopefully, I'll realize the complexity of a biological female every month. There's a lot going on.
I love those videos where they put couples, they put the period cramps simulator. They put it on both of them.
Oh, right.
And the woman
It's like,
oftentimes will sit there and be cool, and then the man is like, whoa, this is what you feel. Because it's one thing to put it on the dude and then be like, oh, it feels like this. But you have to like put it on the woman and like make sure it actually feels like that. And she's like, yeah, I just think it's so cool that.
because you're just like, this is like, you know, Tuesday.
Yeah, I think those are cool.
Yeah, I used to when I was in my late teens and I was playing basketball in college. I used to like puke from my cramps, and I would be white for like, I mean, I'm super white anyway, but I was like transparent for like 3 days because I was just like in so much pain. And every time my coach would be like, my coach was really hardcore, and there were some points where she was like, you look like you're gonna pass out. Why don't you rest? I'm like, no, just like, it's better to keep doing something, right? Distract yourself from the pain. And I'm sure everybody has dealt with that who's a biological female, where there's times when you're like, oh my gosh, you just keep going, you don't have a choice. So remember, corpus luteum secretes estrogen and progesterone, continues to nourish the uterine lining, helps to nourish the embryo. The CG is also saying, hey, I'm here, don't contract. So let's talk about sperm. Sperm are produced in the male gonads, the testes. They are a lot simpler in structure. Sperm do not even have a full set of organelles.
Oh.
The oocytes do, that sperm only have, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. When we're looking at the male reproductive system, beside the testes where the sperm are produced, everything else is accessory structures. The important thing is so kind of two things about all of the other organs and tissues in the male reproductive system is that they are to get the sperm to the female and then to help the semen develop, which is also going to help get the sperm to the female. This like store sperm, it says that in the textbook. It doesn't store it much, but it temporarily stores it in the epididymis so that they can grow their tails. Okay, so again, remember, like all of this stuff is just trying to get, so all of this from the testes on, all this stuff is just to get the sperm to the oocyte. So in the testes, sperm are produced. Once sperm are produced, they temporarily, kind of just like a few days, sit in the epididymis, where they further develop and they go from being like a cell to having a tail. Once they have their tails, they can go up the vas deferens. The vas deferens are a pretty long tube. I always think like biologically it's pretty interesting that from the penis and the testes, they're right next to each other, but the sperm just don't go right out. They've got a lot that has to be added to them so that they can help get to the oocyte. So they've got a long journey. Instead of just going from here to here, they've got a long journey to do that. So here they develop their tails. They're going to travel up and over the bladder. They're going to go past 3 different glands, and those glands are going to add to the semen. So the vas deferens brings them past the seminal vesicle, through the prostate. In the prostate, you have a merging of the vas deferens with the urethra, goes past the bulbourethral gland. So again, these 3 add to the semen. We'll talk about what they add and why. And then they're going to go through the penis, but the penis has structures inside, not just the urethra, but the corpus spongiosum. It's on both sides of the urethra. So there's a little thin part here, but also a larger part on the bottom. And then there's a larger part of this kind of corpus tissue. It has that sponge stuff in it. but has caverns. It's called the corpus cavernosum. So again, I always remember corpus cavernosum has these boxes or caverns. So that's a corpus cavernosum. And then spongiosum is it only looks spongy. All right, so sperm production. The testes are filled with tubes called seminiferous tubules. This is where the process of meiosis occurs to make those primary and secondary spermatids. We'll take a look at the process of meiosis as well to make the sperm. The seminiferous tubules bring the spermatids, the spermatids to spermatogonia to the epididymis. One of the things I want to point out is, like, look at all of the tubes that are packed inside of the testes and the epididymis. So lots of tubes. What that means is the more coiled little tubes means more surface area for a lot of sperm to be able to be produced. So that's why they have all these little coiled up tubes in there. Lots and lots of surface area. If you looked at a cross section of one of these tubes, so if we took one of these tubes and we cut it open and we looked down on it, you'd see the tube part, the opening part, and then you would see a variety of specialized cells. What this is indicating that these spermatogonia cells are producing sperm. So that they go into this tube area and then they travel down those tubes to the epididymis. All right, so very different process of meiosis in making of sperm rather than making of the oocytes. The sperm go through this process and produce 4 equal-sized sperm. Kind of the classic way we learned about meiosis. Meiosis and, again, the oocytes very different to make those polar bodies. The point is that each sperm has a set of 23 chromosomes. So here we're going from 46 chromosomes to 46 times 2, which is 96, but we call it 46 times 2, because each of these, that's a really weird thing, each of these counts as 1 times 2, not 2 each. Call them 1 times 2 because they're connected. It's important to understand it's 1 times 2 or 46 times 2, that here what we have is their sister chromatids are still connected. So what we get here is 23 sets times 2. And we never call something an individual chromosome until here. So each of these gets 23. So really we're talking about 46 times 2, 2 sets, 23 times 2, 2 sets of 23, and 1 set of 23 each. So each of your sperm gets 23 chromosomes. As I said before, the sperm do not have a whole set of organelles. The sperm get acrosomes in their head, which we'll get to why, I think, next time. A nucleus that has those 23 chromosomes. They have what's called a midpiece that are packed with mitochondria. The mitochondria are going to use sugars for energy that is in the semen to power the tail so that they can swim. You have all this, right? They look like your typical, what you think of like a sperm cell, is that they should look like that. Okay, so conduction of sperm. We go from the seminiferous tubules. Remember, these are in the testes, into the epididymis. The epididymis, make sure you just note here, the epididymis stores the sperm and adds their tails. They get their tails here. from the epididymis, leading out of that is a long tube called the vas deferens. The vas deferens is going to go up and over the urinary bladder, and it's going to pass 3 other glands that are going to add to the sperm to make semen. Eventually, in the vas deferens, it merges with the prostate. It merges in the prostate with the urethra, and it leads out the body. Kind of weird that the same tube is used for sexual reproduction as well as urination. Maybe efficient or weird, I don't know, just different, right, than what the females have.
So because those two kind of like combine at one point, are like infections kind of common?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, not common, but susceptible. Infections you're susceptible in a female too. It's just weird, right? Like,
because like with females, like everything is close, so they're prone to infection. So I think maybe these are prone to infections too because they combine.
yeah, and not as prone to infections from the digestive system as a female, though. So it's yeah.
You said urine is fairly sterile too, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fair, yeah.
All right, that makes sense.
I mean, it's not 100%. Like, people think that urine is completely sterile, but it can have bacteria in it too. It's not super common, but there's a whole class of people who drink their urine because they believe that like the extra, especially like vitamins that we don't use, all the water soluble vitamins, everything that's not A, D, E, and K, most of the other nutrients, vitamins, are peed out. So like if you only need, let's say, 500 milligrams of vitamin C per day, and you're taking a supplement in addition to eating some citrus every day, or other like leafy greens will have vitamin C, that you pee it out. And so people are like, well, I don't want to waste that, I'm going to drink it. They do it every day.
Polyurea?
Yeah, it's got other stuff that is like waste products. So I'm always like, I worked at the aquarium before I worked here, and one of my office mates, she was like, yeah, so my partner, he has a wine glass, he pees in the morning, he drinks his urine. She's like, I just let it go.
Ew.
And I was like, but, and she's like, I know, I've told him, he knows. Yeah.
That's gross. It's a red flag.
Right? And then people say, like, if you're lost in the wilderness and you're dehydrating, you definitely can drink your urine to try and rehydrate you. It's, better than dying, but that would be it, right? Like, if I was going to die from dehydration, I might consider drinking my urine, but I might. Right, it'd have to be like super duper extreme. So we just went through this. All right, so a little bit about semen. The semen is ejaculated from the penis. The semen contains sperm and fluids from 3 different glands. So remember, one of the things that's like a misconception that if men have a vasectomy, the only thing that's not present in the semen is the sperm. Everything else is in there. So a lot of people are like, men are hesitant because they have this thing in their head that's going to affect sexual function, but it doesn't at all. At all. A lot of lack of education on that. So 1, seminal vesicle. The seminal vesicle is going to produce sugar to help those mitochondria spin, move, so that it can fuel the tail to swim. Also prostaglandins. Prostaglandins is like a class of hormones that cause contraction. Females produce prostaglandins during childbirth to help the uterus contract and push the fetus out. So both species, both sexes produce prostaglandins. Prostate gland Also has things that are going to help the sperm to swim. Produces kind of like sodium bicarbonate to help, like what the pancreas does to produce sodium bicarbonate to lower acidity in the chyme. The prostate gland is going to produce things that are going to help to neutralize the acidity of the vagina. That's one of the other external barriers of the immune system, is that the vagina is more acidic than other places in the body, because then it can easily break down any foreign invaders to that area. So there has to be some neutralization, because otherwise the sperm, when they get into the vagina, they'll just get dissolved. So vagina acidity has to get lowered. The bulbourethral gland, it produces mucus to help the penis get into the vagina. Sometimes the bulbourethral gland will be referred to as the Copper's gland. So all of these are going to help get the sperm to the oocyte. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the negative feedback system to create sperm in the body. Remember, negative feedback means there's going to be a chain of events that happen, and the last one is going to produce something to tell the first one, we're good for now. Just like in the biological female, when you have the production of the oocyte or the gamete, here in the production of the gamete, GnRH from the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the release of, stimulate the pituitary gland to release LH and FSH. So really similar at the start. LH is going to stimulate the production of testosterone in the testes. Testosterone plus FSH together are going to stimulate spermatogenesis, or the formation of the sperm. So they're going to cause meiosis in the testes, in the seminiferous tubules, to form the sperm. During spermatogenesis, the formation of the sperm, there's going to be another chemical called inhibin. I like the name because the inhibin is going to diffuse into the capillaries, go into the blood, travel up to the head, and it's going to tell the hypothalamus, we got a lot of sperm right now, we're good, stop producing GnRH. So that's why we call it a negative feedback loop, because there's something produced at the end. When you have the thing that you wanted in this chain, the sperm produces, the production of sperm goes through the blood, tells the brain, stop hypothalamus from producing GnRH. So what's the point? Sperm production, you don't want it constantly produced. Once a batch of sperm is produced, it's like, okay, we're good for now. Once the sperm are released, then more can be produced. Otherwise, males would be in a constant state of sperm production, which means that it'd have to go somewhere. What would the world be like? So you have an illustration on the other page that shows you this whole process laid out for you, which everything going from one to the next. So hypothalamus produces GnRH, diffuses into the area around the pituitary gland, which stimulates the LH and FSH to be produced. LH stimulates the interstitial cells to produce testosterone. FSH and testosterone stimulate the Sertoli cells of the testes to produce sperm, but also in that production of sperm releases inhibin, a chemical that travels through the blood, back up to the brain, and tells the hypothalamus stop. Okay, so if male hormone levels told the hypothalamus to just keep producing GnRH, What's the result of this? Read them all.
Probably E.
So A is true, right? These would be high. Testosterone would be high. Oh wait, so 2 of them are correct, right? If you just stopped here, you wouldn't realize that this would be, no, that's not true, right? And that's not true. But A and B are true. So E covers A and B together. LH, FSH, testosterone will all be high if GnRH were to continue to be produced. So always make sure you read, because you are, especially as you go on, I personally don't like to ask too many questions like this, but occasionally I'll throw one in there. Like your last exam had something that was like A, B were true, and then the next one said something, and the last one said A and B are correct. And a lot of you got that wrong because you didn't read the whole thing. You stopped at A. So not everybody's as nice as me, plus you're all going to take a lot of boards, and the boards love to ask questions like this, where few of them are true, and this one's the actual answer because it combines them. So make sure when you're taking exams, you read every answer. All right, copulation is internal fertilization. So there's really good things about that, because if we're talking about like the vagina, and then remember the penis is like this, and the prostate stimulates it to become erect. If the penis was like this, how would they get together? But then it fits upward into the vagina. So there's kind of like a point of that erection is to get there. The other thing is that then the penis getting into the vagina gets the sperm from the penis closer to, remember that the oocyte is up here in the fallopian tube, that it gets it closer than if you're in the ocean and they're just kind of like floating around and hoping to bump into each other. So internal fertilization has really good like design in terms of evolution to get them close together. But also allows for anything that's like up with the penis, like diseases. If the penis has diseases, can transmit those diseases easily to the vagina, and vice versa. If the vagina has diseases, can transmit them to the penis. So while internal fertilization has really good things about it and getting the gametes close together, it also can allow for the easy transmission of diseases too. Remember, or we haven't talked about this, sorry. The sperm and egg unite, I kind of mentioned it, I guess, in the oviduct, ovarian tube, fallopian tube. So it doesn't happen in the vagina, doesn't happen in the uterus, it happens in the fallopian tube. The layers around the oocyte, so you got the corpus luteum, begins to develop as the layers, the follicle cells, as the follicle cells around the oocyte develop more and more. Those layers develop even more in the next few days to 2 more layers. And the point of having a bunch of layers around the oocyte, we're going to see that once one sperm wiggles through, those layers are going to basically like change in chemistry and like become solid, so that it blocks any other sperm from getting in. Because too much chromosome is bad, and each ejaculation has millions, thousands to millions of sperm in it. So here's the thing to think about, right? You've got one oocyte with one nucleus, with one set of 23 chromosomes, and you've got maybe like by the time they swim around inside of the female and get to the oocyte, there's usually thousands of them. Thousands of them are bombarding the oocyte, but we only want one to get in. Crazy. It's like kind of amazing that. The other thing that happens too is that these layers are so chemically like strong from preventing sperm to get in that there needs to be at least like hundreds, if not thousands of sperm contributing the enzymes from the acrosomes. Remember the head has acrosomes? So when they hit the oocyte, those acrosomes kind of explode out of the head and start to surround the oocyte outer layer. And what it does, it starts to weaken that outer layer so that one of them can like wiggle through these like chemically strong outer layers of the oocyte. So this is a really important thing, is that in an ejaculation, there has to be hundreds, if not, well, in an ejaculation, there's gotta be like thousands, if not millions of sperm, because once they get in there, they might go up the vagina and just spin around inside of the uterus. And remember, there's 2 fallopian tubes, so some of them are gonna go that way. Not all of them are going to find the oocyte. So by the time some of them get there, there's gotta be enough that can contribute acrosomes to weaken the outer layer. So low sperm counts, which may be caused by endocrine disruption and other things in our world right now, low sperm count can mean that even though sperm are produced, there's not enough sperm that can contribute enough acrosomes to weaken the outer layer of the egg. And so that's why when we're talking about like reproductive problems current day, that it's really important to have a high sperm count. So it could be the issues with the biological female or issues with the biological male, or both. And so for different reasons, we kind of discussed all of them so far. All right, outer layer is called the corona radiata. And I mean, who knows if it's hundreds or thousands of sperm that have to get there. Probably depends on the compatibility genetically of both the production of the oocyte and what the sperm are contributing. There's another layer inside of that that's called the zona pellucida. So the corpus luteum has continued to develop and mature into these 2 layers on the outside of the oocyte. So it's kind of wild that once one sperm gets through the corona radiata and the zona pellucida, so like this one who's gotten in there, it's going to stimulate these outer layers to become solid. So some sperm are never going to make it even into the layers, but if there are sperm that are in those layers, they get frozen basically inside of those layers. They get solidified so that one gets in. On occasion, maybe 2 at the exact second get in. And if 2 sperm got in, wiggled maybe from both sides, right? At the exact second, what that would probably result in is that a miscarriage, right? Or well, I should say non-fertilization. Or even if fertilization occurs, it could result in a miscarriage. So just timing-wise, crazy. This is sea urchin, but it should give you an idea of the size of the oocyte in comparison to the size of individual sperm. The oocyte is huge, and I'll talk about that next time. So I don't know, there's millions, thousands, millions. I'm not sure who was counting these, and that's why those numbers can vary greatly depending on what you're reading. All right, first one in causes everything else. First one in will fuse the head with eventually the nucleus of the egg. But in the meantime, once one gets in, a lot of things happen. The first sperm that gets in causes the corona radiata and the zona pellucida to solidify, and then once one gets in, it stimulates the second phase of meiosis to occur in the oocyte. So you got a lot going on. So just think like the oocyte has to keep track of all of that. How many sperm are in, who gets in first, waiting to undergo that second phase of meiosis, and then doing the second phase of meiosis, and then the meeting of the nucleus of the sperm and the oocyte, the egg. And then it has to start undergoing mitosis. Okay, so we're gonna stop there. Next time, we'll talk about the sperm and the penis and the vagina getting together and how that can transmit diseases easily, which we're going to explore in lab. So we'll meet you in there.